I have seen the arc of history bend under the weight of legal decisions that at first seem technical, procedural, and remote from the everyday lives of citizens. Yet, in truth, the fate of nations often hinges on such quiet moments. The Ninth Circuit Court's ruling that allowed the Trump administration to deploy the National Guard to Portland was one of those moments. On its face, it was a narrow legal question whether a temporary restraining order against federal deployment should be stayed, but beneath that technical language lay something far more profound: the reconfiguration of power between federal authority and local sovereignty, and the weakening of democratic restraint in the name of security. The court, widely known for its liberal leaning, surprised many by siding with the administration, granting them the legal space to send troops to protect an ICE facility in Portland for the administration. This was heralded as a major victory for those of us who have lived long enough to recognize the warning signs. It was a fracture line opening in the foundation of the republic. The language of the ruling was telling. The judges spoke of the federal government's inability to execute its functions without National Guard assistance. This phrase, clinical and seemingly pragmatic, carries enormous historical weight. It invokes the doctrine that when civil authorities are deemed insufficient, the central government may override local control to enforce order. It is a doctrine with a long and dangerous lineage, one that has been invoked at moments of deep national crisis, sometimes to protect civil rights, but just as often to expand the reach of centralized power. Portland's local law enforcement was portrayed as insufficient. Its capacity to protect a federal building called into doubt. And so, under the cloak of administrative necessity, the line between civilian governance and militarized enforcement blurred. The state was no longer the primary arbiter of its own public order. The federal executive had asserted its will. For the protesters who filled the streets in the days leading up to the ruling, this was not an abstraction. The No Kings movement, with its millions of participants across more than 2,000 rallies, represented a warning from below that the republic was veering towards something darker. The administration dismissed them as small, a familiar rhetorical move of those who wish to deny the scale of dissent. But the scale was not small. It was massive, and it was deeply human. People sensed, perhaps more instinctively than analytically, that the deployment of armed forces to American cities against the will of local leaders was a threshold moment. A republic remains a republic only, so long as the coercive instruments of power remain accountable to the people, not just to a single office or man. I have often said that democracies rarely fall with gunfire. More often, they erode through quiet legal authorizations, rulings that seem temporary, and precedents that outlive the crises they were meant to address. The Ninth Circuit decision carried exactly that kind of potential. It did not mark the end of democracy, but it illuminated how the road to its undoing might look: legal, procedural, justified and devastatingly effective. In history, such moments are rarely reversed. Power, once expanded, seldom contracts of its own accord. That is why this ruling matters. It was not just about Portland or about an ICE facility. It was about the shifting center of gravity in American governance. It was about the republic itself. I have watched enough governments rise and fall to know that the language of security is almost always the prelude to something deeper and more dangerous. The Trump administration's push to deploy the National Guard to Portland did not emerge in a vacuum. It stood within a long lineage of state power expanding under the banner of public order, often during moments of tension when citizens, courts, and legislators failed to grasp the scale of what was being set in motion. America has always claimed a proud tradition of civilian control and localized authority, but moments like this reveal how fragile those principles truly are. By invoking the government's inability to execute its functions without military support, the administration signaled not only that it would use force, but that it was willing to normalize it. When emergency measures become routine, the distance between democracy and authoritarianism narrows almost imperceptibly throughout history. Executive power grows fastest, not during wars between nations, but during domestic crises, real or manufactured. In 1957, President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce the segregation, a morally justifiable action rooted in constitutional protection. But even that precedent, once extraordinary, opened pathways for future leaders to claim emergency authority. In 1968, President Johnson invoked federal power during civil unrest after 9/11. New security doctrines placed unprecedented power in the hands of the executive branch. And in 2020, President Trump publicly threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy military forces against American citizens. Each step is justified in its time. Each step leaves a deeper imprint on the structure of governance. By the time the Ninth Circuit gave its approval to National Guard deployment in Portland, the soil had already been prepared. It is not only the action itself that matters, but the way it reshapes the moral architecture of a nation. When soldiers patrol a city not as responders to a natural disaster, but as enforcers of federal will, the symbolism cuts deep. Portland was not a war zone. It was a city in protest. The protests were messy, at times intense, but they were fundamentally a civic act. 7 million Americans across more than 2,000 rallies took to the streets, united in their warning against what they called an authoritarian agenda. These were not foreign adversaries, but citizens, yet in the official language of deployment, they were reduced to risks, impediments, and security problems. This is how democratic language mutates the citizen, becomes the subject becomes the threat, and the threat becomes justification for control. What concerns me most is how easily such justifications are absorbed by the political class. Speaker Johnson, echoing the president, dismissed the protesters as small and communist, deploying rhetoric designed to delegitimize and isolate rather than engage. It is a pattern familiar to any student of democratic decline. Authoritarianism rarely arrives under its own name. It arrives dressed as law and order, cloaked in the language of national necessity. Those who dissent are painted not as fellow citizens, but as enemies. And in that division, the moral center of the republic begins to fracture. To many Americans, the National Guard is a symbol of order, not oppression. That is precisely why its misuse is so dangerous. Once the federal government crosses the line of deploying military power against its own population outside of a natural disaster or rebellion, it opens a door that rarely closes. Rome crossed it when the Praetorian Guard became an instrument of imperial power. Weimar crossed it when emergency decrees became political weapons. Chile crossed it when domestic security forces turned on their own people. History offers no shortage of warnings. The deployment to Portland may appear narrow and legally contained, but its shadow reaches far beyond Oregon. It is the shadow of executive force reaching into civil life, and if history teaches us anything, that shadow does not easily retreat. I have learned over the course of my life that when governments make fateful decisions in the halls of power, the first to feel the weight of those decisions are always the people in the streets. Portland was no exception. In the days leading up to and following the Ninth Circuit's ruling, the city became more than a geographic location. It became a symbol of resistance and a testing ground for the Republic's soul. The No Kings movement, born of frustration and fear, spread far beyond the Pacific Northwest to 7 million Americans across more than 2,000 rallies, marched with signs, chants, and a shared understanding that something fundamental was shifting. They sensed what many in Washington refused to acknowledge, that the line between democracy and coercion was beginning to blur. Watched the images and read the testimonies. These were not fringe extremists, as some politicians so casually claimed. Many were ordinary people, teachers, nurses, veterans, retirees, standing shoulder to shoulder with younger generations who had grown disillusioned with the notion that democratic institutions alone would protect them. They carried handmade signs declaring no kings in democracy or autocracy. Their message was not subtle, and neither was their fear. They saw a president willing to override local authority, a judiciary willing to grant him power, and a political class too divided or too complicit to stand in the way. These citizens understood that history does not wait politely. It advances with or without consent. The administration, of course, responded not with dialogue, but with derision. President Trump dismissed the movement as small, and his allies painted the protesters as dangerous, un-American, even communist. This language is not new. It has appeared again and again throughout history whenever those in power seek to delegitimize dissent. In the 1960s, civil rights marchers were called agitators. In the 1930s, labor organizers were smeared as radicals. And now, in the third decade of the 21st century, Americans exercising their constitutional right to protest were branded enemies of the state. This is how movements are discredited before they are crushed through rhetoric designed to drain them of moral legitimacy. But what struck me most was the strategic silence of many who should have spoken. The deployment debate was unfolding against the backdrop of a government shutdown, with politicians calculating electoral gains while millions took to the streets. Speaker Johnson and others used the protests as a political foil, portraying them not as citizens in anguish, but as partisan theatrics. Yet, when 7 million people gather in one weekend to warn of creeping authoritarianism, this is not theater. It is a democratic alarm bell. History shows that when such warnings are ignored, republics pay a price. They can never fully recover. There is also a moral dimension here that runs deeper than the headlines. Protests are not merely political events, they are expressions of collective dignity. When people march in defense of their democracy, they are not asking for power, they are reminding their leaders where power is supposed to come from. The decision to deploy National Guard troops against such a backdrop is therefore not neutral. It is a statement about who is heard and who is dismissed, about whose fear is recognized and whose is silenced. That is why Portland matters. It is not simply about one city or one court ruling. It is about whether the United States still belongs to its people, or whether the machinery of power has begun to move beyond their reach. I have often said that democracies die not when people stop caring, but when their caring no longer matters. If the cries of millions can be brushed aside as small, if dissent can be legally contained and politically mocked, then the road ahead grows darker. Portland was a mirror reflecting not just the anger of the people, but the indifference of those who govern them. And history teaches us with chilling clarity that when such mirrors are ignored, the next chapter is rarely written in protest signs, but in the language of force. When republics falter, it is rarely the streets alone that determine their fate. It is the courts. A nation can endure protest, division, even economic turmoil, but when the judiciary bends under the weight of politics, the very architecture of democracy begins to creak. The Ninth Circuit's decision to allow the Trump administration to deploy the National Guard to Portland was cloaked in the language of legal reasoning. Judges spoke of functions, of risk, of public safety, but beneath those legal terms was a moral and constitutional crossroads. The judiciary was not merely interpreting a narrow point of law, it was defining the boundaries of executive power in a moment when those boundaries mattered more than ever. For decades, Americans have been told that the courts stand as the great guardians of the Constitution, immune to the passions of politics, but courts are made of people, and people do not stand outside history. The Ninth Circuit, often perceived as liberal, startled many observers when it sided with the administration, granting it power to override local authority. In doing so, the court effectively accepted the federal government's claim that it could not execute its functions without the National Guard, a claim that went beyond the immediate facts of a protest and entered the realm of precedent. Precedent is the invisible scaffolding of state power. Once a court grants a power, it is almost never taken back. Future administrations of any party inherit it, wield it, and normalize it. This is how extraordinary powers become ordinary. The deeper danger lies not only in the decision itself, but in its chilling implications for federalism. The American Republic is built on a careful balance between state and federal authority. That balance is what prevents a centralized government from imposing its will unchecked. When a president can deploy federal troops to a state over the objections or limitations of local authorities, that balance weakens. And when courts endorse such action, they transform what should be an emergency measure into a legally protected instrument of executive control. In history, this pattern is tragically familiar. In Weimar Germany, emergency decrees issued under Article 48 were repeatedly upheld by the courts, each time with solemn legal reasoning. Within a few years, those same legal foundations were used to dismantle the republic itself. The legal language of the Portland case, as reported, emphasized the inadequacy of local law enforcement that is a familiar justification. Governments throughout history have claimed that local forces are insufficient to maintain order, thereby centralizing power under the guise of necessity. Yet necessity, once invoked, becomes a door through which authoritarianism walks quietly. The judiciary's role should be to guard that door, to demand proof, proportionality, and restraint. Instead, in this moment, it opened the door wider. I speak as someone who has seen how fragile legal institutions can be when power tests their strength. Laws are only as strong as the people entrusted to uphold them. Constitutions are only as enduring as the moral courage of those who interpret them. The Portland ruling did not mark the formal collapse of judicial independence, but it revealed how the courts can become entangled in the logic of power by treating executive claims of necessity as sufficient justification. The judiciary inadvertently shifted the balance of the republic itself. There will be other cases, other crises, other administrations. Each will look back on this moment and find a precedent ready to be used. That is why this ruling matters so deeply. It is not simply about Portland or ICE facilities or temporary restraining orders. It is about whether the courts still stand as a brake on power or whether they have become conduits for it. The difference between the two is the difference between a democracy that bends and survives and one that bends and breaks. Every era of democratic decline has its language, its rallying cries, its moral disguises. In this moment, the language was law and order. The Trump administration framed the deployment of the National Guard to Portland as a matter of protecting federal property, specifically an ICE facility, and upholding the rule of law. But behind that language was something far older and far more dangerous, the politics of fear. Fear has always been the most potent instrument in the arsenal of power. It creates urgency, demands obedience, and erases nuance. In times of fear, citizens are told to trust authority blindly because questioning it supposedly endangers the nation. Portland became not only a city under watch, but a symbol through which fear could be manufactured, directed, and politically harvested. In the administration's narrative, the protesters were not fellow citizens exercising their rights. They were portrayed as threats, enemies, cows makers. The president dismissed them as small, while Republican leaders, including Speaker Johnson, invoked language designed to stigmatize and delegitimize, calling them communist and un-American. The goal was not to engage their concerns, but to recast them as dangerous outsiders. This technique is neither new nor accidental. It mirrors the strategies used by governments throughout history to divide societies, to pit order against freedom, and to make the public believe they must choose between safety and liberty. It is a false choice, but it is politically powerful. The ICE facility itself played an outsized role in this theater. It was never just about a building. It was about constructing an image of a nation under siege by focusing on the facility as a target. The administration framed the protests as an existential challenge to the state's ability to enforce its laws. This framing allowed it to claim extraordinary powers while appearing to act within the law. And when the court sided with them, even temporarily, the executive gained not only legal ground but emotional ground, the kind of psychological leverage that can reshape public opinion. Fear thrives on symbols. And the ICE facility became exactly that, a symbol of state power under threat, and therefore justified in its use of force. What makes fear so corrosive to democracy is not simply that it empowers leaders, but that it disarms citizens, fear fragments communities. It makes neighbors suspicious of one another. It transforms debate into silence. In Portland, the protests that once carried the moral clarity of civic resistance began to be reframed by those in power as evidence of disorder, of danger. And many Americans, exhausted by political conflict, overwhelmed by uncertainty, quietly retreated. This retreat, more than any speech or court ruling, is what enables power to grow unchecked. History shows us that authoritarian systems do not require the majority to support them. They only require the majority to stand aside. The politics of fear has deep roots in American history. It was used during the Red Scare, during McCarthyism, after 9/11. And again, now, not as an aberration, but as a recurring instrument of governance. Each time leaders claimed that extraordinary measures were necessary to protect the nation, each time civil liberties were contracted in the name of security, and each time the state grew stronger while the citizen grew more isolated, the deployment to Portland fits squarely within this pattern. a protest movement was cast as a threat, fear was amplified, and the machinery of power expanded in response. I say this not to cast blame on one administration alone, but to point out how fear corrodes the moral foundations of a republic when leaders use fear not to protect but to control. They abandon the spirit of democracy itself. The republic becomes less a community of citizens and more a stage upon which power performs its dominance. And when courts, legislators, or ordinary citizens allow that performance to proceed unchecked, they become part of its script. In Portland, fear was not simply an emotion, it was a tool, and history warns us that tools like this, once sharpened, are never put away easily. When I look at Portland, I do not see an isolated event. I see the echo of many moments throughout history when republics began to hollow from within. I have spent my career studying nations that believe themselves too exceptional to fall into authoritarian patterns, only to find that their own institutions carried the seeds of their undoing. The deployment of the National Guard to Portland, backed by judicial authority, justified through the language of security, is not new. It is a familiar page from the political playbook of declining republics, a page written in Rome, Weimar, Santiago, and countless other cities where governments slowly turn their coercive instruments inward. In ancient Rome, the Praetorian Guard was created to protect the state, but as the Republic faltered, it became the tool through which emperors secured and maintained their power. What began as protection ended as domination. In Weimar Germany, emergency decrees under Article 48 were used in the name of security and stability, paving the way for the collapse of the democratic order. Each step was legally justified, carefully worded, procedurally sound, and historically devastating. In Chile, the military was slowly brought into domestic governance under the justification of protecting the nation from internal threats. Within years, the republic was silenced. None of these collapses happened in a single day. They unfolded through decisions that at the time felt pragmatic, even necessary. History's great lesson is that democratic erosion often disguises itself as lawful order. America, too, has walked dangerously close to this path before. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, justified through legal reasoning and upheld by the Supreme Court, was framed as a matter of national security. The post 9/11 security apparatus expanded surveillance powers far beyond their original scope, entrenching them into everyday governance. Each moment was presented as exceptional, none remained. So the Ninth Circuit ruling on Portland may seem modest by comparison, but precedent is a patient creature. Once established, it grows in scope, often outlasting the crisis that gave birth to it. Portland's story is also about the transformation of the citizen's role in a republic. In thriving democracies, citizens are subjects of law, but also authors of it, participants in shaping their collective destiny. In eroding systems, citizens become objects to be managed. The protesters, millions of them, were no longer seen as agents of democracy, but as disruptions to be contained. This shift in perception is subtle but profound. It signals a state no longer listening to its people, but managing them. And once that shift takes root, the slide is difficult to reverse. I have seen how nations convince themselves they are immune. They point to their constitutions, their elections, their proud histories, and say it cannot happen here. But history is littered with the remains of nations that said precisely that the Romans believed their republican traditions would endure. The Germans trusted their legal institutions to hold the line. The Chileans believed their democracy was too stable to fracture. All were wrong. The moment when the state begins to normalize the use of extraordinary power against its own people is the moment when the path forward forks one road toward renewal, the other toward slow, incremental authoritarianism. The echoes of empires past are not distant metaphors. They are warnings written in blood and law. Portland was not an empire's fall, but it was a tremor, a sign that the pillars of restraint are not as unshakable as they seem. And in the language of history, tremors often precede earthquakes. The real danger is not that the guard was deployed once, but that it can be deployed again under new pretexts against new groups with broader powers, each time normalized a little further. History's warning is simple and merciless. No republic is immune from the consequences of its own complacency. I have spent my life studying nations at moments of crisis, when the balance between liberty and power tilts under the weight of fear, ambition, and complacency. In every case, the turning point has not been merely about armies, courts, or presidents. It has been about whether a society chooses renewal or allows itself to drift toward ruin. The decision to allow the Trump administration to deploy the National Guard to Portland stands as one of those defining moments for the United States. It is not a footnote in a legal journal. It is a mirror held up to a nation asking whether its constitutional promises still mean what they once did. Empires and republics do not fall because of one act alone. They fall because societies stop believing they can reverse course. The United States was founded on a radical idea that power must be restrained, checked, and ultimately answerable to the people. That principle has been tested many times during wars, depressions, racial reckonings, and foreign crises. It is being tested again now, not by a foreign invader, but from within. The Ninth Circuit ruling, the militarization of a domestic protest space, the rhetoric that turns citizens into enemies, all of it forms part of a deeper pattern. It is the slow normalization of coercion as governance. Democracy does not collapse only when tanks roll down its avenues. It collapses when its people accept that coercion is normal, legal, or necessary. And yet, history also shows that decline is not inevitable. Republics can renew themselves when conscience overcomes complacency. renewal begins with the courage to name what is happening. It begins when citizens refuse to let fear define the boundaries of their freedom. It requires leaders who do not merely invoke the Constitution, but defend its spirit, leaders who understand that the use of force against one's own people is never a victory, no matter how skillfully it is wrapped in legal language. It demands courts willing to act not as servants of power, but as guardians of principle, drawing bright lines that even presidents cannot cross. It requires institutions that understand restraint, not as weakness, but as the very foundation of democracy. The protests that filled the streets after the ruling carried more than anger. They carried memory of how fragile democracy is when it is not defended, memory of how easy it is to lose what once felt unshakable, and memory, if it is not ignored, can be a force of renewal. The No Kings movement may have been dismissed from the podiums of power, but its warning should not be dismissed by history. For 7 million citizens to rise and say no to unchecked authority is not a small thing. It is the heartbeat of a republic trying to remind itself who it is. I believe that moral realism requires seeing the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The Portland ruling is not an abstraction. It is a sign that the guardrails are weakening, but moral realism also insists on the possibility of human choice. The United States stands at a fork in the road. Down one path lies the quiet consolidation of power, more rulings, more deployments, more normalized fear. Down the other lies renewal, a conscious effort to restore restraint, to protect the dignity of protest, and to rebuild faith in the idea that power is accountable to the people, not the other way around. History will not make that choice. Courts will not make it alone. Presidents, senators, and judges will not make it for the nation. The choice belongs, as it always has, to the people. If Americans forget that the republic will hollow out from within, leaving behind the shell of its own promise. But if they remember, if they stand, speak, and act, renewal remains possible. Democracies do not endure by accident. They endure when conscience triumphs over fear. This is the moral line upon which the United States now stands. Portland was not the end of that story. It was its warning shot. What comes next will decide whether this republic rediscovers its soul or slowly surrenders it to the logic of power.